For as long as anyone can remember, people have been disappearing in these woods. It's not something that's widely talked about, and the general public remains blissfully unaware, but the truth lingers like a dark secret. Most disappearances are written off as accidents, lost hikers, inexperienced campers who veer off the trails, the kind of things we can rationalize, but the unsettling reality is that many vanish without leaving a single clue behind. It's not just hikers or those who wander too far. Sometimes it's seasoned adventurers, the ones who know every inch of the terrain. As a park ranger, I've seen this happen more often than I care to admit. At first, it was easy to attribute it to human error. I'd tell myself that nature was simply indifferent, and sometimes accidents happen. But after 2 decades on the job, I've learned there's something else at play here. It's not just nature's unforgiving hand that takes these people. There's a deeper, darker force lurking beneath the surface, something beyond our understanding, something waiting. I've been part of countless search parties. We'd sweep the forest with dogs, helicopters, and volunteers, covering every inch of ground. But for some of these cases, there's nothing to find. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of struggle. It's as if the person simply ceased to exist. The trees stand silent, offering no answers. The forest, vast and indifferent, swallows them whole without leaving a trace. The most disturbing part is how frequently it happens. It's not a rare occurrence, as you might think. Every few months, someone new goes missing. Sometimes they're found after a few hours, disoriented but alive. Other times, they're never found at all. And when we do find them, they've often changed in ways that are difficult to explain. Their faces are hollow, their eyes distant, as if they've seen something unspeakable. What haunts me the most, however, are the ones who are never found. They haunt the families, the friends left behind, and us, the searchers, who are forced to face the fact that these woods are not what they seem. Every disappearance chips away at our understanding of the natural world. The woods are vast, ancient, and they follow their own rules we are not privy to. I've thought about leaving this job many times. The weight of those missing souls is heavy, and the questions are endless. But every time I think about quitting, something pulls me back. Maybe it's the hope that one day I'll find an answer, or maybe it's something darker, something that has a hold on me now. Whatever it is, I know the disappearances won't stop, and neither will the mysteries of this place. There's a particular spot deep in the northern part of the park that has always given me chills. It's a clearing, but you won't find it on any map. Most people don't even know it exists, and that's probably for the best. Something about that place feels wrong. The air is different there, thicker, almost oppressive, and the sounds of the forest seem muted. It's like the trees are holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The first time I stumbled across the clearing, I was on a routine patrol. There was nothing unusual about the day, but as I ventured deeper into the woods, I felt an inexplicable pull towards that spot. When I stepped into the clearing, I was hit by an overwhelming sense of unease. The place was unnaturally still, like time had stopped. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. I've been back there many times since, usually to search for people who've gone missing. And every time, it's the same. The clearing feels like a different world, a place where the usual rules of nature don't apply. Over the years, I've had to pull more than a few people out of there. Some were alive, others, not so much. But the ones who survived were never quite the same afterward. They came back broken, hollow, as if they'd left a part of themselves behind in that cursed spot. One case in particular stands out. About 10 years ago, a little girl went missing while her family was setting up camp. We searched for days, scouring every inch of the forest with dogs and helicopters. On the 4th day, we found her in that clearing, standing perfectly still, staring into the distance. She was physically unharmed, but it was as if her mind had been erased. She wouldn't talk, wouldn't respond to anyone. She just stood there, transfixed by something none of us could see. I'll never forget the look in her eyes as we carried her out of the clearing. She kept glancing back, like she was leaving something behind, something she couldn't bear to part with. We took her to the hospital, but no one could explain what had happened to her. Physically, she was fine. Mentally, she was gone. Her family moved away not long after, and that was the last I heard of her. I avoid the clearing now, unless I have no other choice. There's something there. something ancient and malevolent, and I don't think it likes being disturbed. The fewer people who know how to find it, the better. Some places aren't meant to be found, and I'm convinced that clearing is one of them. The case of the missing girl was the first time I realized that something was truly wrong with this place. It was about 10 years ago, and we received a call from a family who had lost their daughter while setting up camp. It wasn't uncommon for kids to wander off, especially when their parents were preoccupied, so we weren't overly concerned at first. We assumed she'd be found quickly, probably scared and hiding somewhere nearby. But as the hours turned into days, it became clear that this was no ordinary case. We scoured the entire area with every resource available: dogs, helicopters, search teams. For 3 days, we found nothing. No footprints, no clothing, not even a broken branch that might indicate where she'd gone. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The forest was holding its secrets tight, and we were powerless to pry them open. On the 4th day, everything changed. We found her, but not in the way we expected. She was standing in the middle of the haunted clearing, perfectly still, as if she'd been frozen in time. Her clothes were dirty, and there were scratches on her arms and legs, but she was otherwise unharmed. Physically, she was fine, but mentally, it was like she wasn't there anymore. She wouldn't respond to us, wouldn't talk, wouldn't even acknowledge her parents. I remember trying to coax her out of the clearing, but she resisted. Not violently, just stubbornly. It was like she didn't want to leave, like something was holding her there. We eventually had to carry her out, and even then, her eyes kept darting back to the clearing, as if she were afraid to leave it behind. There was something deeply unsettling about her behavior, something that still haunts me to this day. We took her to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with her. Physically, she was in perfect health. Mentally, it was a different story. She didn't speak a word for weeks, and when she finally did, it was as if she'd forgotten everything about herself and her family. It was as if the forest had taken her mind and left her body behind as a shell. Her family was never the same after that. They moved away not long after, and I never heard from them again. But I think about that girl often, and I wonder what she saw during those 3 days. What did she experience in that clearing? And more importantly, why did she want to stay? I'm not sure I'll ever have the answers, but the memory of her empty eyes still lingers, a constant reminder of the forest's dark, unknowable power. 5 years after the incident with the girl, another case shook me to my core. This time, it was a man, an experienced hiker who had been coming to the park for years. He knew every trail, every hidden spot, and he always checked in before heading out. He was cautious, never took unnecessary risks, and was the kind of guy you never worried about. But then he disappeared, and all the rules I thought I understood were shattered. He was hiking in an area not far from the haunted clearing, a stretch of trail that he'd walked countless times before. When he didn't return as scheduled, we launched a full search. I assumed we'd find him quickly, maybe injured or lost, but alive. That's how these things usually go. But after days of searching, there was nothing. No sign of him. No footprints, no clues. It was like he had simply vanished into thin air. On the 5th day, we found something. His backpack, leaning against a tree as if he'd just set it down a moment before. The contents were still inside. Water, snacks, a map. Everything was untouched, but there was no sign of him. Not a footprint, not a broken branch. The area around the tree was undisturbed, as if he'd placed the backpack there and walked off into another world. We combed the area, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The strangest part was that the backpack looked like it had been placed there recently. There was no sign of wear from the elements, no animal tracks nearby, nothing to suggest that it had been there for days. It was as if he had just set it down minutes before we found it. But he was gone, completely and utterly gone. That case haunted me for a long time. I couldn't stop thinking about it. How could a man so experienced, someone who knew the park better than most, just disappear without a trace? And why leave the backpack behind, perfectly intact? It didn't make any sense, and it still doesn't. We never found him, not a single clue as to what happened. It's like the forest swallowed him whole. There are days when I think about that tree, that backpack, and I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, walking the trails in some other version of the park that we can't see. Maybe he stepped through a doorway that we don't know exists, and maybe, just maybe, he's trying to find his way back. Over the years, I've noticed a disturbing pattern among the few who do return after disappearing in these woods. They're not the same. Something is different about them, something subtle but unmistakable. At first glance, they look fine, physically unharmed, sometimes even in perfect health. But the change is in their eyes, in the way they move, the way they speak. It's like they've left a part of themselves behind, and what comes back is just a shell. The first time I noticed this was with the little girl who had gone missing for 3 days. When we found her in the clearing, her body was there, but her mind, it was somewhere else. She didn't speak for weeks, didn't respond to anyone. It was as if the person she had been was gone, replaced by someone or something else, and she wasn't the only one. Over the years, I've seen it happen to others who've been lost and then found. There was a man, a seasoned hiker, who had gone missing for 2 days. When we found him, he was sitting by a river, staring blankly into the water. He didn't seem to recognize us, didn't seem to know where he was. We brought him back to the station, and eventually he started talking again, but he was different, distant, like something inside him had been dulled, like he was walking through life in a fog. Another woman, lost for a week, came back with no memory of what had happened. She had been found wandering near the park's edge, disoriented and confused. She couldn't explain where she had been or how she had survived, but it was clear she had changed. Her family said she was never the same after that, growing more and more distant until, eventually, she just faded. Not physically, but emotionally, mentally. It was like the spark that made her who she was had been extinguished. I've read the reports, combed through the evidence, but nothing makes sense. There's no logical explanation for why these people come back changed. No trauma, no injuries, no signs of foul play. It's as if something in the woods takes a part of them and replaces it with emptiness. And the worst part is, not everyone who comes back recovers. Some just fade away, piece by piece, until they're barely recognizable as the person they once were. I don't know what happens to them out there. I don't know what they see or experience. But whatever it is, it leaves a mark. A deep, invisible scar that never truly heals. And I can't help but wonder if one day, it'll happen to me too. The case of the vanishing college students was one of the most terrifying incidents I've ever encountered during my time as a park ranger. It started like any other camping trip. 4 students, all experienced in the outdoors, headed into the northern part of the park for a weekend getaway. They checked in with us before heading out, their spirits high, and everything seemed fine. But that was the last we heard from them, until one of them came stumbling back into the station 3 days later, alone. The boy who returned was in terrible shape. His clothes were torn, he was covered in dirt, and his face was etched with terror. He couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop muttering the same thing over and over. It took them. It took them. It took hours to calm him down enough to get any kind of coherent story out of him. But even then, his tale was fragmented, filled with gaps that he couldn't, or wouldn't, explain. From what we could piece together, the group had been hiking through the northern part of the park, off the main trail but still familiar with the area. According to him, it started with a strange feeling, like they were being watched. At first they tried to brush it off, but then they started hearing things, distant voices, though there was no one around. It was unsettling, but they didn't think much of it until the first night, when one of their friends disappeared. They woke up in the middle of the night to find his sleeping bag empty, his shoes and pack still where he'd left them. The boys swore they had searched for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate where he had gone. They were scared, but they tried to stay rational, assuming he had wandered off and they'd find him in the morning. But by the next day, another one of their friends was gone, just vanished, without a sound. The boy who returned claimed he had seen the last disappearance happen. They were walking back toward the station, trying to stay together, when suddenly, his last remaining friend was just gone. 1 second she was behind him, the next she wasn't. No sound, no struggle, just emptiness. That's when he ran. He didn't stop until he made it back to the station. terrified out of his mind and unable to explain what had taken his friends. We launched a massive search effort, combing every inch of the area where they had been. We found their camp, just as the boy had described. 3 sleeping bags, 3 packs, untouched, as if they had just stepped away for a moment. But there was no sign of the students. No footprints, no struggle, nothing. It was like they had vanished into thin air, and we never found them. To this day, their disappearance remains one of the most disturbing mysteries I've ever encountered. As the disappearances grew more frequent, I started digging into the park's history, trying to find anything that could explain the strange occurrences. I found something: old stories passed down by the native tribes that once lived in this region. These stories spoke of spirits that roam the land, unseen but always present, and of places in the woods where the boundary between our world and another is thin. They warned that those who ventured too far into these places might not come back, and if they did, they wouldn't return as the same person. At first, I brushed these legends off as folklore, stories told to keep people away from dangerous areas of the forest. But as more people vanished, and those who returned came back changed, I started to reconsider. What if there was some truth to the tales? What if these woods really are a place where the veil between worlds is thinner than anywhere else? It sounds ridiculous, I know. But the longer I work here, the harder it is to ignore the possibility. One story, in particular, stood out to me. It spoke of a clearing deep in the woods, a place where the spirits could pass freely between worlds. According to the legend, this clearing was a place of power, a doorway between realms. Those who entered might find themselves slipping into another world, one where the rules of nature and time don't apply. The spirits would sometimes take people, and if they returned, they were never quite the same. The more I thought about the haunted clearing where we found the girl and the other strange disappearances, the more I began to wonder if this place described in the legends was the same spot. The parallels were hard to ignore. The stillness, the strange feeling in the air, the way people seemed to change after being there. Could it be that this clearing was one of those thin places where something from the other side was watching, waiting to pull people through? I started talking to the older rangers, those who had been around longer than me. Some of them dismissed the stories, but a few gave me knowing looks. One man, a grizzled veteran with 30 years on the job, told me that he'd seen things in those woods that defied explanation. He wouldn't say more, but the haunted look in his eyes told me all I needed to know. He believed the stories, even if he wouldn't admit it outright. I don't claim to understand what's happening in this forest. Maybe it's just folklore, a way to explain the unexplainable. But when you've seen as many strange things as I have, the line between myth and reality starts to blur. Sometimes, I wonder if the disappearances are a sign that the boundary is growing thinner. Maybe one day, the veil will tear completely, and whatever is on the other side will come through for good. 5 years ago, a young girl vanished while camping with her family deep in the park. Despite a massive search effort, she was never found. Her parents were devastated, but after months of fruitless searching, they had no choice but to accept the possibility that she was gone for good. But then, one morning 5 years later, she walked out of the woods. Same clothes, same face, looking exactly as she had the day she disappeared. She hadn't aged a single day. When the ranger who spotted her first saw her, he thought he was hallucinating. It was early morning, just after dawn, and she was standing at the edge of the trees near an old fire tower we no longer use. At first, he assumed it was a lost hiker, maybe a child from another camping group. But as he got closer, he realized she was the same girl who had vanished all those years ago. Her clothes were tattered, worn by time, but her body hadn't aged a day. They brought her back to the station, but she wouldn't speak. She just stared blankly ahead, her eyes distant, as if she were still somewhere else. It took hours before she said anything, and when she finally spoke, the words chilled me to the bone. She said she had been with him. When we asked who he was, she just kept repeating the same thing over and over. The Bear Man. According to her, this creature wasn't entirely human. She described it as a man covered in thick fur, with glowing yellow eyes that followed her everywhere. She said he had taken her to a cave deep in the forest, a place she didn't recognize. She thought she had only been gone for a few days, but when she came back, 5 years had passed. The idea that she had been taken by this creature, this bear man, was terrifying enough, but it was what she left unsaid that frightened me the most. When we asked her to show us the cave, she panicked. She refused to go back into the woods, bursting into tears and screaming that he was still there, watching. Her parents, desperate to get her away from the place that had taken her, moved out of state shortly after. I can't say I blame them. Whatever happened to that girl, whatever she saw during those 5 lost years, it had broken something inside her. I've searched for that cave, the place she spoke of, but I've never found it. And to be honest, I'm not sure I want to. There are some things that are better left hidden in the dark corners of the world, places where creatures like the bear man lurk, waiting for their next victim. It was late fall when the family came to the park for one last camping trip before winter set in. They were experienced campers, a husband, wife, and their teenage son, eager to enjoy a weekend in nature. They chose a site near the northern ridge, a place with a beautiful view of the valley below. It should have been the perfect trip, but that night, something terrifying happened, something that drove them away from the park for good. The family settled in for the evening, cooking dinner over the fire and talking about their plans for the next day. As the fire died down to embers, they noticed movement at the edge of the trees. At first, they thought it was just a couple of deer passing by, but then they saw them. 3 figures stepping out from the shadows, tall, thin, and far too pale to be human. Their eyes reflected the firelight in an eerie, unnatural way, and they moved silently, almost as if they were gliding across the ground. The husband, trying to stay calm, called out to them, asking if they were lost or needed help. But the figures didn't respond. They just stood there, watching, their wide, dark eyes unblinking. And then one of them smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too sharp, with teeth that looked more animal than human. That's when the family realized something was very, very wrong. The figures began to move closer, circling the fire in a slow, deliberate manner. They never spoke, never made a sound, but their presence was suffocating. The family did the only thing they could. They grabbed whatever they could carry and ran. They didn't stop until they reached their car, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they sped away, they half expected to see the figures chasing them, but when they looked back, there was nothing. The next morning, we went back to their campsite to investigate. The tent was still there, half collapsed, and the fire pit was cold. But there were no footprints, no sign that anyone, or anything, had been there the night before. The family, visibly shaken, told us what had happened, swearing they weren't imagining things. They were so terrified that they moved several states away not long after, leaving behind the life they had known. To this day, the son still has nightmares about those pale figures. He says he can still see their faces, those wide, unblinking eyes, and that terrifying, unnatural smile. Whatever they weren't human. And I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into their path. There's a story that circulates among the rangers, a tale so strange that it's hard to believe, but I've heard it enough times to know that something about it is true. Deep in the more isolated parts of the park, far off the beaten trails, people have reported finding a staircase that stands alone in the middle of the woods, with no structure attached to it, no explanation for why it's there. Some say it looks old and crumbling, while others say it's pristine, like it was built just yesterday. But all the stories agree on one thing: you should never climb it. The first time I heard about the staircase, I thought it was a joke, some tall tale meant to scare the new rangers. But the more I talked to the veterans, the more I realized they weren't laughing. They spoke in hushed tones, warning that the staircase was no place for the curious. According to them, those who climbed to the top never came back the same, if they came back at all. The reports are always similar. Hikers stumble upon the staircase by accident, drawn in by its strange presence. Some feel an overwhelming urge to climb it, while others turn back immediately, sensing something wrong. But those who do climb it report feeling disoriented when they reach the top. They say the forest below looks different, almost alien, as if they've stepped into another world, and when they descend, they find that they're no longer where they were before. In the worst cases, the hikers never return. Search parties are sent out, but there's no sign of them. No footprints, no clues, just the eerie silence of the woods. Occasionally someone will come back, but they're never the same. They speak of strange things, of seeing the forest twist and change around them, of hearing voices that don't belong. But the most common thing they say is that the stairs are watching them, waiting for the right moment to take them back. I've never seen the staircase myself, but I know enough not to go looking for it. The rangers who've been here long enough know that some things in the park aren't meant to be found, and the staircase is one of them. It's not just a structure, it's a doorway. And once you step through, there's no guarantee you'll come back. There are plenty of theories about the staircase. Some say it's a remnant of an old building, others think it's a portal to another dimension. But no one knows for sure. All we know is that the staircase is dangerous, and those who climb it risk losing more than just their way. A few years ago, a family came to the park for a camping trip. They were a tight-knit group, mom, dad, and their young son, who was confined to a wheelchair due to a spinal condition. Despite his disability, the boy loved being outdoors, and his parents had outfitted his chair with special all-terrain wheels so he could join them on hikes. They chose a campsite near a lake, close enough to enjoy the view, but far enough to feel like they were truly in the wilderness. That night, they sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The boy went to bed early, tired from the day's activities, while his parents stayed up a little longer, enjoying the quiet of the forest. Eventually, they both dozed off in their chairs. When they woke up in the early hours of the morning, their son was gone. His tent was empty, and his wheelchair was still there, right where they'd left it. Panic set in immediately. The boy couldn't walk on his own. How could he have just disappeared? His parents searched frantically, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. They contacted the ranger station, and we launched a search team at first light. We combed the area around the lake, looking for any clue as to where he might have gone, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of struggle. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. 2 days later, we found him. He was sitting on a flat rock near the summit of a mountain, nearly 50 miles from where he had disappeared. It was a place he could never have reached on his own, even if he could walk. But there he was, unharmed, staring out at the valley below, as if he'd been waiting for us. And next to him was a large German shepherd, black and gray, watching over him. The boy was dazed but otherwise fine. He didn't seem to understand what had happened or how he had gotten there. The dog, which no one had seen before, gave a single bark when we approached, then turned and disappeared into the forest before anyone could stop it. We never found the dog, and no one in the area claimed to own one like it. The boy said the dog had stayed with him the whole time, keeping him warm and growling at something in the trees during the night. To this day, I don't know what to make of that case. How did a boy in a wheelchair end up on top of a mountain? And what was that dog? Was it just a stray that happened to find him? Or was it something else, something sent to protect him from whatever lurks in the forest? We never got any answers, and the family moved away shortly after, leaving behind a mystery that still haunts me. There's an area in the park that the rangers call the Dead Zone. It's not marked on any maps, and it's not an official name, but everyone who's worked here long enough knows about it. It's a place where compasses stop working, where GPS signals disappear, and where time seems to flow differently. People who wander into the Dead Zone often report feeling disoriented, as if they've been walking for hours when only minutes have passed, or vice versa. It's a place we avoid whenever possible, but sometimes people go in and don't come out. One of the most disturbing cases involving the Dead Zone happened about 15 years ago. An experienced hiker, a man who had trekked through the park many times before, disappeared in that area. We searched for weeks, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no gear, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. His family was devastated, and eventually the search was called off. A year later, another hiker stumbled upon something strange near the edge of the Dead Zone, a set of clothes hanging neatly on the branch of a tree. They were perfectly intact, as if they had just been placed there. Next to them was a wallet and a set of keys. When we looked closer, we realized they belonged to the man who had disappeared the year before. The weirdest part was that the clothes looked brand new, untouched by the elements, but the man himself was nowhere to be found. I've heard other stories about the Dead Zone, stories that make my skin crawl. People say that time moves differently there, that once you step inside, it's easy to lose track of where you are. Some have reported seeing strange lights flickering through the trees, while others hear voices calling their names, luring them deeper into the forest. Those who are lucky manage to find their way back, confused but unharmed. The unlucky ones, well, we never find them. The dead zone has become something of a legend among the rangers,